Today I'm going to be making a couple of closet doors for the first time. I have made a door before, but it was a barn door, and the difference between a barn door and these doors are a barn door has to cover an opening, whereas these have to fit within an opening. So I have to be a little bit more precise on the measurements. For this project I used a 3/16 for each opening, 3/16 on each side where the hinges go, and then 3/16 in the middle. This was a little bit too big for me, so I would recommend probably 1/8. So far all you've seen me do is cut my 2x10x10 into exact lengths, so it's just easier for me to handle on the table saw. The two pieces to the left is just going to be offcuts. I'm not going to be using that for this project, it's just extra. Now that I'm at my table saw, what I'm going to do is cut the round edges off of one side of each of my pieces. Then I adjust my fence to 3.5 inches and then start cutting my strips out of those. This doesn't really matter to you. This is the size I chose to go with, but you can make it whatever size you decide, whatever looks good to you. After I cut my 4 side pieces and my 2 top pieces, I decided to make the bottom a little bit wider. I measured what was left over from my 2x10 and I decided on 5 inches. So I adjusted my table saw and cut it to width. I also decided that my pieces were too thick, so I decided to trim a 1/4 inch off of each piece. Which was a mistake, and it led to a lot more sanding. After about an hour of sanding, I took a scrap piece of wood and tried to get the blade close to center. I ran it through once and then flipped the board around and ran it through again, which left me with a perfectly centered groove. I then did this to all of my pieces. I bumped the fence over and ran it through again. Then I grabbed a piece of scrap 1/2 inch plywood, which is going to be the center panel, and then I check the fit. Every time I take a little off, I go back to my 1/2 inch plywood and I check the fit until I had a pretty snug fit. Now that my table saw is lined up properly, I can run all my pieces through. After I was done with all my pieces, there was a little bit of material left over in the grooves which I had to remove. So I adjusted my fence and ran them through again. After I ran my first piece through, I just double checked to make sure that my 1/2-inch plywood was still fitting snugly. Snugly, is that a word? Now that we're finished with the grooves, it's time to move on to the tongues, which is only going to be on the top and the bottom pieces, which are called the rails. I laid my scrap piece of wood on the table saw and adjusted my blade. Now that I have my table saw blade adjusted to the right height, I start clearing away material from both ends. And when I'm done, I check the fit. Now I adjust my table saw fence to what I want my tongues to be. Then I do this to both sides of my pieces. Now it's time to move on to the center panel. I take a scrap piece of 1/2-inch plywood and put it into my groove. Take a pencil and score a line. This tells me how much material is going into the groove. My measurement comes out to be 3/8. Now I dry fit all my pieces together. Then measure the inside and add my 3/8 inch on either side. First I measure the width, then I measure the length. And this is the same process. You get the inside measurement and you add 3/4 of an inch on each side. And you end up with the dimensions of your inside panel. Now that I have my dimensions, I take a piece of foam, lay it on the floor, take my 1/2-inch sheet of plywood, lay it on top, and the foam supports the entire sheet while I make my cuts. Find this to be the safest way to cut full sheets of plywood. First, I measure my plywood sheet to the exact length. Then I make my cut. This is a cross cut that I would never be able to do on the table saw safely, so I will do this first. Then I will take my piece of plywood and take it to my table saw and rip them down to final width. Now that I have my two pieces cut, I just glue everything together. And this is pretty straightforward. I wouldn't explain, I'm just gonna let it roll. Now it's time for paint. I did 1 coat of primer and 3 coats of paint. The customer I was building these doors for wanted me to use these because they had it on hand, which makes sense. But if you're going to do this project and you don't have paint, there's paint that I would recommend. I'd leave a link in the description that I've had really good results with. And you just have to do 2 to 3 coats and you don't need any primer. I'm going to leave a shopping list in the description of everything that I've used, the material, from the wood to the hardware. I'm also going to recommend some tools. I'm not going to recommend all the tools that I have used in this video because I'm just going to link the ones that I've used and really like and that I would buy again. But there's some tools that I do use in this video that I would try to get rid of, so I'm not going to recommend those for you. Only the tools that I've had really good experiences with. I also sanded between each coat so I can get a better finish. So these are the hinges that I'm going to be using. I have 6 in total. Since I have 2 doors and they'll be opening like French doors, I had to take the pin out of 3 of them and just flip them over. This was pretty easy. I used a nail punch and a hammer. After I had my hinges, I lined up my hinge and I started to install it onto the door, making sure to pre-drill with my VIX bit. Just in case you don't know what a VIX bit is, it is a drill bit that has a guide that drills a perfectly center hole, which is used to install hinges. After I was done with the first door, I realized that I had a little accident, so I had to fix this before I moved on to the other door. And then I tried to remove the piece of wood without damaging anything or removing any material. Then I put glue on both pieces and clamped it down. I let the glue dry and then removed the clamp. I sanded it down smooth, and then I put wood filler and then sanded it again. Next, I just applied some primer and then 3 coats of paint. And this is what it looked like when it was done. Now I'm going to install the ball hatch. I measured 35.5 inches from the bottom of the door and made my marks. Then I drilled in my hole. Now it's time for the door handles. These are going to be dummy handles because you're not going to be able to turn them. You just pull on the handles and the door opens. All I did was take the template out of the box and cut the pieces out that I needed. Then I used this template to drill the holes for the screws. Then I installed it. Then it was time to install. This was a little bit nerve-wracking for me because, like I said, this was the first time that I had to fit a door within an opening, so it had to be precise. I was a little off at first, but then I had to shim the left side of the door, and then it worked out okay. I don't have a lot of footage with me installing because I was in someone else's house and I didn't want to take up much time. And this is the finished product.